TSA agents calling in sick at double the normal rates, leading to longer lines at security checkpoints at the airport. Now, some argue that this is the time for the government to get out of airport security, hand it over to the private sector instead. Let's bring in Romina Boccia of the Heritage Foundation to discuss all of this. The airlines, many of them yesterday, Romina, warning that we're at a tipping point with this shutdown. Is that the catalyst for privatization?
I think it should be. It's long overdue. If you look to Europe, most of their airports have privatized security forces. Even some U.S. airports are using a program that allows them to use private forces to do this. Canada fully privatized its Transportation Security Administration in 1996. So this is very common, and private security forces are actually doing at times a better job than the federal government does, and doing so at lower cost. 15% less cost per passenger, which means lower ticket fees for people flying.
The Heritage Foundation, where you work, estimates that privatization would produce $465 million in savings in 2019 alone. So cheaper and arguably more effective, but how exactly would privatization work?
It really isn't that difficult. The government can continue to regulate air traffic and airport security, but doesn't have to provide the entire labor force. So all those unionized federal workers that aren't getting paid right now, if they worked for private contractors, if they worked for private companies that provided the service, they could get paid. They wouldn't be affected by this government shutdown, and we wouldn't see these long lines at U.S. airports.
But overall, when we're not in a shutdown, how would you grade the TSA? How are they doing on the job?
Well, the federal government inspects them as well, and this is one of the problems. On the one hand, they regulate themselves to provide the services, and they also inspect themselves, which is really not a good program. And when they were tested, they let through about 90% of weapons in this one test that were smuggled through. That's a real issue. They're not performing their job at the highest level, and they're not using the best technology. It's time for the private sector to step in and do a better job.
Yeah, I also want to ask you a quick question about the next battle. We're dealing with the shutdown now, trying to find a bipartisan compromise. We have to do much the same in March when we have to raise the debt ceiling. How do you expect that fight to pan out?
So the debt ceiling returns in March, but the Treasury actually has a number of loopholes available for itself to continue deficit financing the federal government, likely until summer or fall. So what I think is likely to happen is we're going to see a big funding discussion looking at the Budget Control Act caps, because there's a funding cliff coming up for defense that the president will want to avoid. So there'll be tense negotiations at the same time that the debt limit might bind later this summer. So this current impasse does not bode well for those negotiations because we're not seeing much movement towards compromise.
Romina Boccia, thank you for your time this morning. Have a good weekend.
Thank you so much.